Hi, and welcome to this session. I'm Stephen Way. I'm a member of the Scout Content National Access Support Unit, and I'm a keen photographer. I've been photographing national scouting events for over 10 years, but I know I've still got plenty to learn. Normally you'll see me running around Gilwell with a couple of these, shooting pictures which get used in social, in advertising and so on. But in this session, we're going to look at some photography hacks to help you get better photos from the camera you've got in your pocket, the one on your phone. So, before we look at some techniques, it's important to emphasize that photography is more about the capture than the kit. That's why I'm talking about using your phone, because as I say, you have it with you all the time. Often you only get a brief opportunity to grab a shot, so keep your eyes open. In Scouting for Boys, BP wrote, one of the most important things that a scout has to learn is to let nothing escape his attention. And for the photographer, this is key to getting great results. This particular picture was a chance picture when I was towing a load of canoes over Tower Bridge. I thought that'll make a good shot, and dispatched an explorer out of the car to run along behind taking pictures. So that's about grabbing the moment and getting the shot. Apart from the chance capture, though, it's a good idea to have an outline of the sort of image you want in your head before you try and capture it. This allows you to think through lighting, the camera position, and possible composition options of the photo before you start shooting. A little planning goes a long way. Not necessarily to draw out in detail every single shot, but if you know what you're going for in the first place, then it's much easier to think through how you can set up to get that picture. When we're shooting a large event, we'll often get a brief that's asking us to get pictures of specific activities, which helps in thinking through how we might shoot them. So as I say, plan your shots. So, let's talk technical for a moment. I'm going to look at some photography basics and how you use them on a mobile phone, because that's the key to understanding how to get better results from your phone camera. Now, I'm using an iPhone, but the same principles hold true on an Android or actually for any camera. You may have to Google the technique or the controls to find out for your camera if it's not an iPhone, though. And I apologise for that, but I don't have an Android to hand to find out. The key principles are focus and the exposure triangle. With exposure, changing one factor means changing the other two, and exposure relies on three different factors: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. On a camera, on a large DSLR, you can change all of these individually, but when you change one, you affect the other two, so you have to be conscious of which ones you change. On a phone camera, you're very limited in your ability to make these changes, although it is possible, as we will see. But first, focus. The most important part of any photography is to get your subject in focus. This is something you can't fix later. Tied to this is exposure, so you can see the subject you're trying to focus on. Let's have a look at how to adjust exposure and focal point with the iPhone camera with the help of my mini superhero friends here. So here you can see the subject of the photo. Now, by holding my finger on Thor and sliding the little sun next to it, I can change the exposure. However, this means the other figures are out of focus. If I want those in focus, I move the square and tap on it, and I can actually lock the focus using the AF lock by holding my finger down. And then I can change the focus on that by sliding the little sun up and down and take another picture. So by moving the focus around here, focus on Thor, change the exposure, you can see what effect that's having, and that's bringing Thor into more focus, and it's lightening the picture so we can actually see his details. So you just tap on the subject and slide up and down. If you tap and hold on the subject, you will get this up here, the auto exposure focus lock will come up, and that will allow you to then move the auto exposure while it keeps the focus, and vice versa. So you can use that to retain the exposure for one area and focus on another, or vice versa. Although it can be a bit fiddly, I have to admit. So, what you need to do is to expose the subject, and what you need particularly to consider is if there's a bright light behind your subject. So what you need to do then is you need to set the exposure for the subject so you can see it. Unless, of course, you want to pick out the sky. So if you're doing silhouettes against a nice sunset, you may want to set the exposure for the sky. So let's have a look at doing this. So here, let's use the wobbly camera. Here, I can set the exposure for the sky, which highlights the clouds. Whereas here, I can set the sign and increase the exposure of the sign. Now, I'm getting some artifacts in the picture because I'm looking at the sun, but you get the general idea. Once more, again, back to the sky to get a more dramatic clouds and skyscape. So you can get interesting effects by focusing on different parts of the picture. You could be looking down a tunnel with a bright light at the end, and you want to expose it so that you can see inside the tunnel rather than the light at the end of the tunnel. Although we could all do seeing the light at the end of the tunnel sometimes. There's another way of doing that. So let's go back to the exposure triangle, and we've looked at basic photo and exposure tools, but we can get more technical and adjust the aperture to control the amount of light hitting the camera sensor. And we do that with the aperture, the f-stop. The bigger the aperture, the more light's allowed in, and so more detail comes onto the sensor. And paradoxically, the smaller the f-stop, the bigger the aperture. So here, an aperture of f2, f2.8 is the largest aperture, and that will have an effect on the ISO, what is these days the equivalent of the film speed, and on this side the shutter speed. On a camera, on an iPhone camera, you can actually change the aperture, but you can't change the other two, at least not with the standard settings, as we'll see. Changing the aperture helps with depth of field, and also if you want to capture motion, if you want to freeze a shot. So, with the later iPhones, you can use the portrait mode to change the aperture and change the depth of field. That's what's in focus in the picture. So let's have a look at this. So we go into the camera, this time in portrait mode. Here we are, back with my small friends. Here you can see portrait mode. We automatically change the depth of field. Now, ignore the fact that the camera is saying move further away. You don't need to take portraits in portrait mode. You can use it to drive the aperture. So here, I'm just going to take a picture first of all, and then I'm going to click this F button up here, which then brings up this scale here for me to change the f-stop and to change the depth of field. So Now, sliding it down, as you can see, keeps forward in focus and takes everything else out. There is software on the iPhone camera that forces this, so this isn't what you'd get on a DSLR, but it's the same sort of effect, it's just exaggerated. When we get up to F9, as you can see, we've actually brought many more of the figurines into focus. So we've changed the depth of field, and by doing that, I'm now going to focus on 4. And again, I can change the exposure, and I've got here I've got Captain America in focus too, just about, so you can see the detail. There's much less blurring in the background. So that's changing depth of field and changing the aperture. They're all things you can do with the standard iPhone camera in the latest iPhones. To control motion, though, you need to be able to control shutter speed. And there's no way of doing this on an iPhone without help, but there are apps that can help. And the same with the aperture on older iPhones. If you download an app, you can get full control over the camera, something that Apple in their wisdom don't give you. You can look in the App Store for camera or DSLR apps for your phone, and indeed for an Android. But here, I've got a license for Adobe Lightroom, which does the same thing, so I'm going to use that. So first of all, in Lightroom, I'm going to select the camera by clicking the button here, and then we'll try and get a picture of a dripping tap. Now, it's helpfully told me that I can change the exposure and adjust the exposure compensation by sliding my finger across swiping across the screen. As you can see, I do that backwards and forwards. As I do that, the ISO changes here, down at the bottom. But actually, it's not the exposure I'm worried about. The exposure is reasonably fine. I set it high. But I'm going to change the speed, which for some reason is called sec here. But here is the shutter speed, and I'm going to move it to a quite fast one, 10,000th of a second. Focus on the tab and see what I can do. So let's have a look at the results. Here is the standard iPhone, and the best I could by making all the various changes I could to make sure I was getting a fast shot. And here's using Lightroom with the ability to control shutter speed. You can see here we've got the droplet of water sharply defined, whereas here it's very blurry. So if you're going to do detailed macro stuff like this, or you want to stop motion, you want to control the shutter speed, you need to get an app. There are free apps, there are pay-for apps, there are, as I've used, camera controls within some processing apps. So let's talk a little bit about composition. I spoke at the beginning about having an idea of what you want, and part of that is composition. And photographers talk about something called the rule of thirds, and you may be aware of this. This is where a good photo is split into 3 to give a balanced composition. And here's a Gilwell 24 photo that I took, which demonstrates the thirds. So you can see how the thirds work. It's not about slavishly keeping something within each third of the picture. It's about using the thirds to compose the whole shot. Now, you don't have to be stuck on that, but it's worth having your photo grid switched on so you can make sure you have a reminder of how the photo is going to be composed and where the elements in the picture are going to sit. And this is all part of developing an eye for composition, an eye for the good shot and the good capture. Let's talk a little bit about lighting. We looked at setting the exposure so we could see the subject, but if available light is limited, you could use the flash, but that can really wash out the subject or be harsh. It's worth considering using a different light source, which can be much more atmospheric. Here, I'm using a birthday cake with my daughter, and here was a torch illuminating a sign in a disused underground station. Campfires, lamps, there's all sorts of torches, there's all sorts of ways of getting additional light into your pictures to make them more atmospheric. But when we're using the flash, if the light's dull or you can't expose the subject sufficiently for what you want, you may need to use flash as infill light to add emphasis. You could also use a torch for infill light. So here you can see the first picture is just taken without flash, the second is taken with flash. And it's quite clear how there's additional emphasis on the people, faces and so on in foreground with the flash, because it's filling in the shadow and giving more focus on them. So that's another technique worth considering. Also, there's burst mode, where you keep your finger pressed and you get a whole load of pictures in burst mode. You'll have seen on social media lots and lots of pictures of people jumping in the air. Here's a picture of a photo team jumping in the air at a winter camp. If you use burst mode, you can get the whole of the stage of the jump in the picture, and then you can go back and delete all the dreadful shots later and have just the one that you want, with everybody airborne or legs in exactly the right position, however you want it. That's another handy technique to save you getting people to jump up and down hundreds of times, and believe me, I've done that as well. So, having talked about a number of techniques, let's talk about processing. Once you've got your picture, the edit function gives you a range of options to tweak it and to make it pop. So let's try it out. So let's select Thor and his buddies off my hall floor. Now you could just hit auto and that will give you a whole raft of changes, which are usually okay. You could play around with exposure, but I prefer not to touch exposure for the minute, but to go and to look at the highlights and to move those up, down, and underexpose them a bit, and overexpose the shadows separately. That gives a little bit more balance in the picture. I can then move the contrast and, if necessary, the brightness, which gives me several options. And you may think the picture's not improving, but actually it's making a difference. You can use the crop option to straighten it and to crop it down to just what you're looking for. So there's Thor and his buddies. And as you can see in this one, in the raw third still works. Thor's just in the lower third. Then you can start to play around once you've got the composition right to really see if you can make it pop. And eventually, you can go back to the exposure and you can then move the exposure so you can underexpose it a bit more to get a bit more detail in it. And you can move the brilliance around, and having underexposed it, you've got a bit more glare there. You might want to turn that down a bit with the highlights. You may wish to bring the shadows back up a bit more just to bring out some of the detail on Thor's outfit. You can play with the contrast. So what I would suggest is to play around with these controls and to see what they do. One thing I would say, though, is watch the vibrance and the saturation controls, because oversaturated pictures can look a bit artificial, and they're always a big giveaway. So anyway, this is me playing around, trying to get the most detail I can on 4 without too much glare, and that's what I've ended up with. So, processing will also, to some extent, help us rescue exposure errors, but it's better to avoid them in the first place by using the techniques I spoke about at the beginning. So let's have a quick look. Here's a picture I took, a selfie I took of the other day of me, and the sky was very bright, so the subject's underexposed. Oops. So the subject's underexposed. So let's go in and see what we can do. Here it is. And what I'm going to do is the same as before. I'm going to turn the highlights down a bit. I'm going to push the shadows right up. And that's improve things a bit. And give the brilliance a little bit, just to give it a bit of push. And then I'll push the exposure up. And that's rescued the picture to some extent. It's not as great as it could be. This doesn't have the control of something like Adobe Lightroom, but it does allow me to adjust the picture to rescue it. So, to finish, to make your phone photos pop, first of all, work on keeping your eyes open and developing an eye for composition and what a good capture would look like. Look at other people's pictures, think about what they've done, because it doesn't matter about the kit, it's the capture that's important. Think and plan how you want your photo to look before you start shooting. So if you're going to an event, think what opportunities are there for groups, for interesting groups, for individuals, to record the action that's there. Where do I want to be? Think through those things, and you'll have a good idea about where you'll get a good capture. That doesn't mean that you have to plan everything. Being in the right place at the right time will get you a newsworthy picture. And then it's definitely the capture, not the composition or the kit that counts. But knowing these things means that whatever your picture, it'll be better. Then when you take the picture, make sure you have the focus and exposure right. Learn how to drive your phone camera, using its features and enhancing the map if necessary. Use the edit function to process your shots for that extra oomph, just to give it a bit more brightness, lighten it up, and so on, using the tools that we had a look at. And then finally, publicise your scouting. Post your pictures on Instagram or Twitter. And if you follow Scout Content on Instagram and Scout Content ASU on Twitter, we can see your great scouting shots. We'll post the best. So thank you for listening to that, and hopefully there's some information of use there. As I say, this is aimed at people using phone cameras in order to get them to think a little bit more about how to drive the camera and how to get great shots, whatever they're doing, so we get more great shots of scouting. Thank you very much.